On a cold Christmas Eve, a grieving mother and her daughter sit in darkness, their home filled with despair. But when an unexpected act of kindness from the very man they judge the most lights up their world, everything changes. Who is behind this mysterious Christmas miracle? Stay tuned to discover a story of redemption, hope, and the true power of compassion. Comments below where you're watching from, and if you like and love our story, kindly subscribe our channel. Life, inspirational, and motivational tales that explore themes of love, unity, and patriotism. Stay with us always for interesting stories. Thanks. Let's start the story. The bitter cold seeped into every crack of Margaret's small home, as if the winter itself mirrored the emptiness inside. She sat at the worn kitchen table, her head resting in her hands, surrounded by a sea of unopened bills. The faint hum of her daughter Emily's soft breathing was the only sound in the otherwise silent room. Across from her, the Christmas tree stood bare, its lifeless branches a stark reminder of what they couldn't afford this year. Emily sat by the frost-covered window, her eyes locked on the glowing homes across the street. Laughter and music spilled from their neighbors' windows, the warmth of holiday cheer so close, yet impossibly far. She rested her chin on her knees, her voice breaking the silence. "Mom," she said softly, "why is Christmas never for us?" Margaret's heart shattered at the question. How could she explain? The shop robbery had left them with nothing, no savings, no security, and now, no Christmas. Her voice caught in her throat as tears welled up, silently slipping down her cheeks. She turned away, hoping Emily wouldn't see her weakness, but the weight of her despair was too much to hide. Outside, Marcus walked down the snow-covered street, his breath visible in the freezing air. His sharp eyes caught the dim light spilling from Margaret's house, the only one on the block that seemed untouched by the holiday spirit. He paused, his gaze lingering on the window where Emily sat, her shoulders slumped in sorrow. A pang of empathy hit him. "Yes, struggling," he muttered under his breath, his heart heavy with understanding. He knew too well what it felt like to have nothing. Determined, Marcus continued walking, a plan beginning to form in his mind. This Christmas will be different, he resolved silently. The snow-covered streets glistened under the soft glow of Christmas lights, a serene beauty enveloping the small neighborhood. Nearly every house sparkled with decorations, strings of twinkling lights, wreaths on doors, and the laughter of families gathered inside. Yet Margaret's house stood in stark contrast, dark and quiet, its windows barely illuminated by the faint glow of a single lamp. Inside, Margaret sat at the kitchen table, staring at the pile of bills and receipts in front of her. The robbery had left her shattered. The thieves hadn't just taken her inventory or cash. They had stolen the future she had fought so hard to secure for herself and Emily. Her once bustling gift shop, a source of pride and livelihood, now sat empty, boarded up, and lifeless. No insurance payout would come. No miracle was in sight. The sharp lines on her face betrayed the stress and exhaustion she carried, her strong-willed nature eroded by the cruel reality of her circumstances. In the corner of the room, her 15-year-old daughter Emily sat cross-legged by the window. She gazed at the brightly lit houses across the street, her breath fogging up the cold glass as she leaned closer. The distant sounds of Christmas carols drifted through the air, underscoring the silence within their own home. Emily turned to her mother, her voice a soft whisper. "Mom?" she asked hesitantly. "Do you think God still hears us?" Margaret looked up, startled by the question. Her instinct was to brush it aside, to shield Emily from the harsh truths she had come to believe. But the weight of her bitterness slipped through. "God doesn't care about people like us, Emily," she muttered. "If he did, we wouldn't be here." Emily's shoulders slumped, her gaze returning to the frosted window. She rested her chin on her knees, her small frame seeming even smaller in the dimly lit room. "I prayed anyway," she said quietly. "I asked him to help us, to make this Christmas special." Margaret said nothing. Instead, she closed her eyes, her heart aching with guilt for not being able to give Emily even a fraction of the joy she deserved. The silence between them deepened, broken only by the faint hum of the radiator struggling to keep the chill at bay. Outside, Marcus Johnson walked slowly past the house, bundled in a thick coat, his breath misted in the frigid air. The faint light from Margaret's window caught his attention, and he paused, glancing inside. He could see the silhouette of Emily by the window and Margaret's slumped figure at the table. The contrast to the joy and vibrancy of the other homes on the street was stark. Marcus had known hardship. Once homeless, he had clawed his way back, working multiple jobs until he could afford a modest place of his own. The holidays had often been the hardest, times when the world seemed filled with light and joy, yet his own life had been shadowed by hunger and loneliness. He understood the pain of going without, especially during a season that celebrated abundance. Luckily, as he stood there, the wind carrying the faint echoes of their voices, he overheard Emily's quiet words. "I prayed anyway. I asked him to help us." A pang of empathy struck Marcus. He recognized the desperation in her voice, the longing for hope in a world that seemed to withhold it. His gaze lingered on the house for a moment longer before he turned and walked home. Later that evening, as he sat in his modest living room, Marcus couldn't shake the image of the dim house, the bare tree, and the sorrow etched on their faces. Margaret's coldness toward him in the past had never deterred his kindness. He knew her disdain stemmed from pain, not malice, and he couldn't ignore the need he saw. "This Christmas shouldn't be like that for anyone," he murmured to himself. He glanced around his home, his eyes landing on the unopened box of decorations he hadn't had time to put up. An idea began to form in his mind. Over the next few days, Marcus quietly set his plan in motion. He visited stores around town, picking out small but thoughtful gifts. Toys for Emily, a warm winter coat for Margaret, and enough groceries to fill their empty pantry. He spent hours carefully wrapping each item, making sure every detail was perfect. Among the gifts, he tucked in an envelope with a modest amount of cash. Enough, he hoped, to help Margaret begin rebuilding her shop. As he wrapped the last package, Marcus wrote a note in neat handwriting. "For a family that deserves joy, Merry Christmas from someone who believes in you." As his wife had been true to father, he placed the note on top of the stack, his heart full but his resolve firm. This wasn't about recognition or gratitude. It was about giving hope to a family that desperately needed it, just as he had once needed it himself. Back at Margaret's house, Emily remained hopeful despite her mother's cynicism. Each night she knelt by her bed and prayed for a miracle. She prayed for warmth, for laughter, and for her mother to smile again. Though Margaret couldn't bring herself to join her, She often stood in the hallway listening to her daughter's quiet prayers with a lump in her throat. As Christmas Eve approached, the air in the neighborhood grew festive, the joy of the season spilling from every corner. Margaret's home, however, remained an island of silence and darkness. But unbeknownst to her, someone was about to change that. The chill of Christmas Eve settled heavily over the small neighborhood, the cold biting at every window pane. Inside Margaret's dimly lit house, the air was thick with tension. The silence between Margaret and Emily had stretched long, broken only by Margaret's occasional heavy sighs as she folded and refolded the same dishcloth. The bare Christmas tree loomed in the corner, its emptiness a cruel reminder of everything they had lost. Margaret's struggles seemed to compound as the holiday approached. The robbery had stripped her of everything, not just her livelihood, but her confidence and sense of security. Now, even the simplest joy of buying a small gift for Emily was beyond her reach. Her frustration boiled over, and she directed her anger at anyone and anything that came to mind. "It's not fair," she muttered, her voice sharp. "People like Marcus, they don't know real responsibility. They don't have a family to take care of or mouths to feed. It's easy for them to just get by." Emily, sitting quietly by the window, frowned but said nothing. She had grown used to her mother's bitterness in recent months. Still, her own heart clung tightly to hope. Turning to Margaret, she said softly, "Maybe God will send someone to help us. Isn't Christmas about miracles, Mom?" Margaret huffed, shaking her head. "Miracles don't happen for people like us, Emily. Stop waiting for something that's not coming." Emily's lips tightened, but she didn't respond. Instead, she looked back out the frosted window, her small hands pressed against the glass. In her heart, she refused to give up. She believed someone, somewhere, would hear their silent plea. Across the street, Marcus sat in his modest living room, finishing the final touches on his plan. He had spent the past 2 days preparing for this moment, pouring every ounce of care into ensuring Margaret and Emily would have the Christmas they deserved. The gifts were wrapped in festive paper, each one adorned with a bright bow. He had picked out a cozy scarf and gloves for Margaret, thinking about how often he had seen her walking to work in the cold. For Emily, he had chosen art supplies and a small stuffed bear, hoping to bring a spark of joy to her young heart. But the most important item sat in a plain white envelope, a modest sum of money from his own savings. It wasn't much, but it was enough to help Margaret restart her shop. He knew how devastating it was to lose everything, and how much even a small gesture could mean in such a time of need. As Marcus packed the gifts into a sturdy bag, his thoughts turned to Margaret's harsh words over the years. She had judged him unfairly, assuming the worst about him based on his appearance and the signature red MAGA hat he often wore. But Marcus didn't dwell on her bitterness. He understood that her pain was at the root of her anger, and he didn't take it personally. "She's hurting," he thought to himself, "and I know what that feels like." The streets were quiet as Marcus approached Margaret's house later that night. The neighborhood was cloaked in stillness save for the soft glow of Christmas lights from other homes. Carrying the heavy bag, Marcus felt a mix of anticipation and humility. This wasn't about being a hero. It was about answering a call for help. Reaching the front porch, he carefully arranged the gifts and the envelope in a neat display. He adjusted the bows and ribbons, making sure everything looked just right. Then, taking a deep breath, he pressed the doorbell and quickly stepped back into the shadows, watching from a safe distance. Inside, the sudden chime startled Emily, who had been dozing lightly on the couch. She jumped up, her heart racing with curiosity. "I'll get it," she called, running to the door. Margaret followed more slowly, her brow furrowed in suspicion. As Emily opened the door, her gasp of delight filled the room. "Mom, look!" she exclaimed, her voice trembling with excitement. "There are gifts and food. Someone brought us Christmas." Margaret froze in the doorway, her eyes widening as she took in the sight. The packages glistened under the soft porch light, their cheerful wrapping paper a stark contrast to the darkness she had felt inside. "Amelia," Emily dropped to her knees, her hands trembling as she touched the gifts. "See, Mom," Emily said, her voice filled with wonder. "God answered my prayer. I told you He listens." Margaret's first instinct was skepticism. She scanned the quiet street, her eyes narrowing as she tried to spot whoever had left the gifts. "Who would do this?" she muttered under her breath. "Why?" But her questions were drowned out by Emily's sheer joy. The young girl began unwrapping the gifts right there on the porch, her laughter echoing into the cold night. She pulled out the stuffed bear, hugging it tightly, and then the art supplies, her face lighting up with excitement. Margaret's gaze fell to the envelope perched atop one of the boxes. She picked it up, her hands trembling as she opened it. Inside, she found the money and the note. The simple words struck her like a thunderbolt. "For a family that deserves joy. Merry Christmas. From someone who believes in you." Tears welled up in Margaret's eyes. She felt a mixture of emotions: gratitude, confusion, and a lingering sense of pride that kept her from fully embracing the moment. She looked down at Emily, who was holding the scarf and gloves with a wide grin. "Mom," Emily said softly, "can we put the decorations on the tree now? It's Christmas." Margaret hesitated, the bitterness she had carried for so long still holding her back. But as she watched her daughter's happiness, something inside her began to shift. With a small nod, she said, "Yes, Emily, let's do it." From his hiding spot across the street, Marcus watched the scene unfold. He saw Emily's joy and Margaret's cautious steps toward embracing the moment. A small smile crossed his face, and he turned to walk home, his footsteps crunching softly in the snow. For Marcus, the act wasn't about recognition. It was about reminding a family that hope still existed, even in the darkest times. The morning sunlight streamed through the curtains, painting Margaret's living room in soft golden hues. Emily was already up, her excitement infectious as she darted around the room, adding the finishing touches to their once bare Christmas tree. The ornaments gleamed, the lights twinkled, and the warmth of a crackling fire filled the room. Margaret stood in the kitchen, stirring a pot of soup, made from the groceries they'd received. For the first time in weeks, the silence in their home had been replaced by the comforting hum of life and laughter. Emily twirled around, clutching her stuffed bear and beaming. "Look, Mom, doesn't the tree look beautiful now?" Margaret glanced up from the stove, her lips curving into a faint smile. "It does," she said softly, her tone carrying a mixture of awe and hesitation. Emily's joy was undeniable, and seeing her daughter so happy tugged at a part of Margaret she hadn't felt in a long time. But amidst the newfound warmth, questions lingered in Margaret's mind. As she sat down to join Emily by the tree, her eyes drifted to the envelope that lay on the coffee table. Picking it up, she traced her fingers over the handwriting. The words, "For a family that deserves joy," echoed in her mind, stirring a complex blend of gratitude and confusion. "Why would anyone do this for us?" she whispered, more to herself than to Emily. "Why would someone care?" Emily looked up, her eyes sparkling with hope. "Mom, it's a miracle," she said firmly. "Someone wanted us to feel happy again. Maybe it's because they know what it's like to feel sad, like we did." She planted a pat on Emily's cheek, and looking over at her son, Margaret didn't respond immediately. She stared at the glowing lights on the tree, her thoughts racing. She remembered her bitter words, her complaints about the unfairness of life, and her cutting remarks about people she barely knew. Guilt began to creep in, forcing her to confront her own assumptions. The next morning, Margaret was still thinking about the mysterious act of kindness when their neighbor, Mrs. Carter, stopped by. The elderly woman was cheerful as always, holding a plate of cookies wrapped in festive plastic. "Merry Christmas, Margaret," Mrs. Carter said warmly, stepping into the kitchen. "Looks like you and Emily had a wonderful holiday after all." Margaret offered a polite smile, though her curiosity quickly got the better of her. "We did," she replied, her tone cautious. "But do you happen to know who might have done this? Someone left gifts and food at our door. It was like a miracle." Mrs. Carter's eyes lit up knowingly. "Oh, that was Marcus," she said matter-of-factly, as though it were the most obvious thing in the world. "I saw him late last night, carrying packages and trying not to be seen. That man has a heart of gold, always looking out for others." Margaret froze, her breath catching in her throat. "Marcus?" she repeated, her voice barely above a whisper. Wilson's cry of pain was directed at her two loved ones. His brain didn't cope with the stress. Mrs. Carter nodded. "Yes, dear. He's done so much for that last storm. He's a good man, donating to families in need, even fixing my fence after that last storm. He's a good man." Margaret's chest tightened. Her mind flashed back to all the times she had judged Marcus, the cutting remarks she had made about him to others. She had dismissed him as a man who couldn't possibly understand real struggles, all because of his appearance and the red MAGA hat he often wore. Yet, he had been the one to step in when her family needed help the most. Seeing him now, where would he do that? Margaret asked, her voice trembling. "He doesn't owe us anything." Mrs. Carter shrugged gently, a warm smile on her face. "Some people don't need a reason to be kind, Margaret. Marcus is one of those people. Maybe he saw that you needed a little hope." As Mrs. Carter left, Margaret sat down heavily at the kitchen table, her hands clasped tightly around the envelope. Tears welled in her eyes as the weight of her realization pressed down on her. Marcus, the man she had mocked and judged so unfairly, had been the one to save their Christmas. That afternoon, Margaret paced the small living room, her emotions swirling. Guilt, gratitude, and a deep sense of shame fought for dominance. Emily sat on the couch, clutching her stuffed bear and watching her mother with curiosity. "Mom, are you okay?" Emily asked, her voice tinged with concern. Margaret stopped and turned to her daughter, taking a deep breath. "Emily, we need to go thank Marcus," she said firmly. "I need to apologize to him for everything." Emily's face lit up. "Can I come too? I want to thank him for the bear." "Lit." Margaret nodded, a small smile breaking through her nervous expression. Together they bundled up in their coats and scarves, stepping out into the crisp winter air. Snow crunched beneath their boots as they made their way to Marcus's house. Margaret's heart pounded with every step, the weight of her past behavior making her hesitate. But she knew this was something she had to do, not just for Marcus, but for herself. When Marcus opened the door, he was surprised to see Margaret and Emily standing on his porch. His expression softened into a kind smile as he greeted them. "Margaret, Emily, Merry Christmas." Margaret hesitated, her words catching in her throat. For a moment, she simply looked at him, taking in the man she had judged so harshly. Then, with a deep breath, she finally spoke. "Marcus, I know it was you," she began, her voice trembling. "I know you're the one who brought us the gifts and the food. I don't know what to say. Thank you doesn't feel like enough." Marcus smiled gently, stepping aside to invite them in. "You don't need to say anything, Margaret," he replied. "I just wanted to help." Margaret shook her head, tears streaming down her face. "But why? After everything I've said, after the way I've treated you, why would you do this for us?" Marcus's eyes softened, his tone calm and sincere. "Because I've been where you are," he said simply. "I know what it's like to feel like the world has turned its back on you. I know what it's like to have nothing and to need someone to believe in you. That's why I did it. Because I've been there, and I didn't want you and Emily to feel that way." Emily stepped forward, clutching her stuffed bear tightly. "Thank you, Mr. Marcus," she said, her voice filled with emotion. "You're the best Santa ever." Marcus chuckled, patting Emily's shoulder. "You're welcome, Emily. I'm just glad I could make your Christmas special." As Margaret and Emily walked home, Margaret felt a profound sense of peace. The kindness Marcus had shown her family had done more than save their Christmas. It had opened her eyes and softened her heart. She vowed to carry this lesson forward, to be kinder, more understanding, and less quick to judge. For the first time in years, Margaret felt hope, a hope that would carry her into the new year and beyond. The day after Christmas, Margaret stood in front of Marcus's house, Emily clutching her hand tightly. The snow crunched softly beneath their boots as they hesitated on the porch, Margaret's heart pounding with a mixture of nervousness and determination. She had spent the entire night replaying the events of the past few days, Marcus's kindness overshadowing her lingering guilt. Now she was here, ready to face the man who had shown her a kindness she hadn't earned. "Mom, are you okay?" Emily asked, glancing up at her mother with wide, curious eyes. Margaret nodded, taking a deep breath. "Yes, sweetheart, I need to say thank you." Her hand trembled as she knocked on the door. Within moments, it swung open, revealing Marcus with a gentle smile. He was wearing a simple sweater, his welcoming demeanor making Margaret's chest tighten. "Margaret, Emmeline," he greeted warmly, "what brings you here?" Margaret hesitated, her words catching in her throat. Finally, she blurted out, "I know it was you. You're the one who left the gifts, the food, everything. I've been so wrong about you, Marcus, and I just want to say thank you." Marcus's smile widened, but his eyes remained calm and humble. "It wasn't about me, Margaret," he said softly. "It was about Emily, and making sure she had the Christmas she deserved. That's all that mattered." Emily stepped forward, holding her stuffed bear close. "Thank you, Mr. Marcus," she said earnestly. "You made this the best Christmas ever." Marcus knelt to her level, his smile radiating warmth. "You're very welcome, Emily." Seeing your smile was all the thanks I needed. Margaret wiped a tear from her cheek. "But why, Marcus? After everything I've said, After the way I've treated you, why would you help us?" Marcus stood, his expression thoughtful. "Because I know what it's like to feel hopeless," he said, his voice steady. "I've been where you are, no money, no support, and no idea how to keep moving forward. But someone helped me once, when I thought no one cared. They gave me a chance to rebuild my life, and I promised myself that I would pay it forward whenever I could." Margaret's breath caught. She felt the weight of her prejudice and bitterness lifting, replaced by a deep sense of gratitude and humility. "You've taught me something I'll never forget," she said, her voice trembling. "I judged you without knowing you, and I'm so sorry. Your kindness has changed everything for us." Marcus nodded, his gaze understanding. "We all make mistakes, Margaret. What matters is how we move forward." In the days that followed, Margaret reflected on her behavior and her newfound understanding. She began to see her neighbors, not just Marcus, but everyone, with a fresh perspective. Her heart softened by her selflessness. She shared her story with others, encouraging them to let go of their biases and embrace compassion. "Sometimes we're so quick to judge," she told a friend over coffee. "But Marcus showed me that kindness doesn't need a reason. It just needs a heart willing to give." Emily, inspired by Marcus's actions, found ways to spread kindness in her own small ways. She started volunteering at the local shelter, helping other children who were struggling. "If Mr. Marcus could help us," she told her mother one evening, "I want to help someone too." Margaret smiled, pride swelling in her chest. "That's a beautiful thing, sweetheart. Kindness always comes back around." On New Year's Eve, Margaret invited Marcus over for dinner. The small house, once dim and lifeless, was now filled with the warmth of laughter and light. The fully decorated Christmas tree stood proudly in the corner, its twinkling lights casting a soft glow over the room. Emily buzzed with excitement, showing Marcus the crafts she had made and recounting every detail of their Christmas morning. As they sat down to eat, Margaret raised her glass. "To kindness, second chances, and the people who remind us what truly matters," she said, her voice steady with gratitude. Marcus clinked his glass with hers, a quiet smile on his face. "To hope and new beginnings," he added. The evening was filled with stories, laughter, and a sense of connection that Margaret hadn't felt in years. As midnight approached, she found herself silently thanking Marcus not just for his gifts, but for showing her the beauty of compassion and the strength of forgiveness. Mind's success at the Luna Belly decision cast her in a strange light, shaping a new path for her. That night, as Margaret and Emily stood at the window watching fireworks light up the sky, Emily turned to her mother. "Do you think we can make next year even better, Mom?" Emily's face twisted in agony. Margaret smiled, her heart full. "Yes, sweetheart, I think we can." Marcus's kindness had transformed more than their Christmas. It had given them a new outlook on life and a renewed belief in the power of humanity, and for that they would always be grateful. Margaret's story reminds us all that even the smallest acts of kindness can create ripples of change. Her transformation from bitterness to gratitude, driven by Marcus's selflessness, resonates deeply with anyone who has experienced or witnessed prejudice. Marcus's quiet resolve to help, even in the face of judgment, highlights the extraordinary impact of compassion. It's a powerful lesson. Kindness can bridge divides, heal wounds, and inspire hope where there once was despair. Think about your own life. Have you ever been shown kindness when you least expected it? Or have you realized the beauty of compassion after judging someone unfairly? These moments stay with us. They remind us of the strength we have to uplift others and the courage it takes to change our perspectives. We'd love to hear your stories. Share them in the comments below and inspire others to embrace compassion and understanding. Let's build a community of hope and positivity, one story at a time. And don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more heartwarming tales that celebrate the power of humanity. Together we can spread the message of love, forgiveness, and the incredible strength of second chances.